I'm 32 years old and so is my wife. We've been together since high school, where we first started dating. It wasn't hard for me to fall in love with her. She was vibrant, creative, and had this infectious energy that made her stand out. She had her quirks, of course, scatterbrained, always misplacing things, constantly rushing because she was late. But at the time, those traits felt almost charming, a testament to her carefree spirit. They were the kind of things I thought time and routine would smooth over. After years of dating, we married at 25. I walked into our marriage filled with hope and a sense of certainty that she was the one I wanted to build my life with. I'd seen her at her best, but I'd also experienced moments when her chaotic tendencies were a little tiring. I was aware of her shortcomings, but I believed we could navigate them together. The decision to marry wasn't rushed. It was grounded in years of knowing each other. Still, marriage was a shift. It's one thing to love someone in the freedom of separate lives, and another to share every corner of your world. I was ready for that challenge, or at least I thought I was. I'm not a perfect person either. I knew this wasn't a relationship where one partner was flawless and the other needed fixing. What I didn't anticipate was how much those quirks, her lateness, clutter, and constant unfinished projects would escalate. But even as they began to weigh on me, I held on to the belief that love meant patience. This is the story of how those years unfolded, of the frustrations and realizations, and why I feel an apology might have been owed. Looking back on our dating days, I can't help but smile. We were just teenagers then, figuring out who we were while navigating the whirlwind of first love. She was unlike anyone I had ever met, full of ideas, always dreaming big, and radiating a contagious enthusiasm that drew me in completely. At that stage, her quirks were just a part of her charm. She had this endearing habit of losing things, keys, her phone, even her backpack once, but she would always laugh it off with a shrug, brushing it away as if it didn't matter. And for the most part, it didn't. I was happy to help her retrace her steps or lend her mine when she misplaced something. It felt like such a small price to pay for the joy she brought into my life. Her chronic lateness was a running joke among our friends. If we planned to meet at 6, we'd tell her 5:30 to have a chance of her showing up on time. Sometimes I'd wait, watching the minutes tick by, a mix of amusement and exasperation building. But then she'd arrive, slightly breathless, always apologizing with that wide, disarming smile of hers, and I'd forget the frustration almost instantly. She had this knack for starting projects, painting, writing poetry, even learning the guitar, but rarely finishing them. Her bedroom was a snapshot of her mind, half-filled journals, stacks of unfinished canvases, and scattered guitar picks. It was messy, sure, but it was also fascinating. Her creativity had no bounds. She just struggled to channel it. I didn't see these things as flaws back then. If anything, I admired her for how much she tried, even if she didn't always follow through. I think I convinced myself that with time, maturity, and maybe a little influence from me, she'd find her stride. In hindsight, I realize how naive that was, but in those moments I was just happy to be a part of her world. We were in love, and love at that age feels invincible. When we got married at 25, I believed we were ready. After nearly a decade of dating, I felt I knew her inside and out. The quirks that had once been a charming part of her personality seemed manageable, even endearing. I assumed that with the stability of marriage, we'd naturally fall into a rhythm where her tendencies would smooth out over time. But marriage was different. It wasn't about brief moments together, followed by the ability to retreat to our separate spaces. Now everything was shared. The routines, the responsibilities, the messes. Those quirks that had once felt minor began to take on a new weight in our day-to-day life. At first, I tried to adapt. Her lateness meant we often missed out on plans or arrived flustered, but I started building buffers into our schedule. If she forgot something at home, I'd double-check for her before we left. When her half-finished projects began to take over more and more space, I made peace with a bit of clutter. I told myself it wasn't a big deal, but there were moments when I couldn't ignore it. Simple tasks like finding a clean counter to cook dinner or navigating her scattered belongings in shared spaces began to feel like obstacles. It was as though her world was spilling into every corner of mine, leaving little room for me to breathe. Still, I held on to the belief that this was temporary, that with time and gentle encouragement, she'd find a way to manage the chaos. After all, marriage is about compromise, right? I wanted to be supportive, to give her the space to grow without feeling criticized. But as the months turned into years, it became harder to reconcile the gap between the marriage I envisioned and the one we were living. When we decided to buy a house, it felt like a milestone. We were finally leaving behind the cramped apartment we'd shared for the first 2 years of marriage and stepping into something bigger, something ours. She was thrilled about the extra space, particularly the storage. "This will help us stay organized," she said with a hopeful smile. I believed her, or at least I wanted to. The house itself was beautiful, a blank canvas ready for us to make into a home. We had plans for every room. She wanted a craft space where she could paint, sew, or write. I was excited about having an office to focus on work or unwind. We agreed to keep the common areas clean and functional, a shared effort to maintain order in this new chapter. But the clutter followed us. The craft room quickly became a dumping ground for unfinished projects, old supplies, and things she'd get to later. It didn't stop there. One by one, the storage spaces she had once been so excited about filled with random items. Boxes of clothes she no longer wore, books she'd never read, decorations she forgot to put up. Soon 2 entire bedrooms became off-limits to me, consumed by her things. I tried not to let it bother me, but when her overflow began creeping into my office, I couldn't ignore it anymore. Papers, art supplies, and stray knickknacks would pile up on my desk. I'd move them aside only to find more the next week. We had conversations about it. She would acknowledge the mess, promise to sort it out, and then never follow through. I wanted to be understanding. She wasn't intentionally trying to take over the house, but that's what it felt like. It wasn't just about the physical clutter. It was about the emotional weight of feeling like my space, our space, was disappearing under the chaos. Still, I told myself this was part of marriage, a problem we'd solve together. But with every passing month, it felt less like something temporary and more like the new normal. As the years went on, my patience began to wear thin. The clutter wasn't just a matter of aesthetics. It was creeping into every aspect of our lives. Trying to keep the house functional felt like a never-ending battle, one where I was the only one fighting. I'd spend hours cleaning up her messes, only to find new ones the next day. It felt like pouring water into a bucket with a hole at the bottom. Her lateness too became more than a quirk. It was a constant source of stress. Whether it was meeting friends, attending appointments, or just getting out the door for errands, we were always running behind. I'd give her reminders, set alarms, and even try to start the process earlier, but nothing seemed to help. The anxiety of always being late began to take a toll on me. What frustrated me most was how cyclical it all felt. She'd acknowledge the problem, get frustrated with herself, and make grand plans to change. For a few days, I'd see her attacking the clutter or making an effort to be on time, and I'd feel hopeful, but inevitably the cycle would repeat. The plans would fizzle out, and we'd end up back where we started. I started to feel resentful, not because I didn't love her, I did deeply, but because it felt like I was carrying a disproportionate share of the emotional and physical labor in our home. I didn't know how to express this without it sounding like criticism, so more often than not I stayed quiet. I told myself it wasn't worth starting a fight over, but the weight of those unspoken frustrations was building, and I could feel it seeping into how I viewed her and our marriage. In an effort to make sense of everything, I started researching. The more I read about behaviors associated with ADHD, the more the pieces seemed to fit. The chronic lateness, the clutter, the unfinished projects, they weren't just quirks, they were symptoms. It wasn't about laziness or carelessness, it was about how her brain processed the world. For the first time, I felt like I had a framework to understand what was happening. When I first brought it up to her, I tried to approach the topic carefully. "Have you ever thought about ADHD?" I asked, hoping to keep the conversation neutral. Her reaction was immediate and defensive. She dismissed the idea outright, saying it was ridiculous and that I was just looking for an excuse to blame her for her personality. I tried to explain that ADHD wasn't about blame, but about understanding and potentially finding ways to make things easier for her. But she wasn't hearing it. Her perception of ADHD was deeply negative, almost stigmatized. She associated it with severe mental health disorders, grouping it with conditions like schizophrenia or psychosis. Not that there's anything wrong with those diagnoses, but in her mind they were frightening and alien. The idea of labeling herself in that way was unbearable for her. Every time I brought it up, it ended in an argument. She'd accuse me of trying to change her, or of making her feel like she wasn't good enough. It didn't matter how gently I phrased it or how much I emphasized that I loved her exactly as she was. The subject became a landmine, one I eventually learned to avoid. Still, I couldn't help but feel frustrated. If she could just see what I was seeing, maybe things would change. Maybe we could find tools or strategies to make life less overwhelming for both of us. But without her willingness to even consider it, there was nothing I could do. So I kept my thoughts to myself even as the patterns repeated and the strain on our marriage deepened. It was like watching someone struggle in quicksand but refusing the branch you were trying to extend. As the years went by, the patterns became more entrenched. Our home operated in cycles of chaos and fleeting order. She would have bursts of frustration with the state of things, piles of laundry, cluttered countertops, missed deadlines, and would suddenly dive into a frenzy of activity. For a day or two, she'd clean, organize, and even come up with plans to finally get everything under control. I'd watch her with a mix of hope and cautious optimism, silently praying this time would be different. But it never was. The bursts of energy fizzled out as quickly as they appeared. By the end of the week, things would be back to where they started, if not worse. I'd often step in to try to pick up the pieces, sorting through the aftermath of her half-finished tasks. I was tired of tripping over boxes or wading through clutter just to use my office or find a spot to sit. The physical mess mirrored the emotional toll it was taking on me. I couldn't understand how someone so intelligent and capable in so many ways could struggle with things that seemed so basic. Being on time, keeping things tidy, following through. On the surface, it looked like she didn't care, but deep down I knew she did. I could see it in her moments of despair, when she'd break down and call herself lazy or useless. Those moments were the hardest for me. I didn't want to pile on by adding my frustrations to hers, so I stayed quiet. I'd hold her, reassure her, and tell her she wasn't any of those things. And I meant it. Still, the silence on my end came at a cost. I felt like my feelings were always taking a back seat to hers. I was constantly walking on eggshells, trying to avoid triggering another cycle of frustration. It wasn't just the physical clutter that was suffocating. It was the weight of feeling like I couldn't express how I felt without making things worse. Over time, that silence started to feel like a wall between us, one neither of us knew how to break down. It wasn't until much later that I began to think more deeply about how she might have been feeling during all those years. From my side, it was easy to focus on the challenges her behavior created for me: frustration, stress, and the constant juggling to keep things afloat. But what about her? What was it like to live in a mind that couldn't seem to align with the demands of daily life, no matter how much she tried? I realized that she wasn't oblivious to the chaos she created. If anything, she was hyper-aware of it. Her outbursts of frustration weren't random. They were the product of her own disappointment in herself. She saw the mess and felt overwhelmed, paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of trying to fix it. Those bursts of energy, where she'd dive headfirst into organizing or cleaning, weren't sustainable because they came from a place of desperation rather than strategy. When I suggested ADHD as a possible explanation, she likely heard it as criticism rather than concern. To her, it might have felt like I was saying, "You're broken," rather than, "I want to help." Her resistance wasn't about denial. It was about fear. Accepting that she might have ADHD meant confronting the possibility that this wasn't something she could just willpower her way out of. It meant facing a lifetime of struggles and wondering how much of it could have been different if she'd known sooner. I started to see that her defensiveness wasn't just about me. It was tied to how she saw herself. She prided herself on being creative and unique, someone who didn't need labels or diagnoses to define her. My words, even when well-intentioned, probably felt like a threat to that identity, and while that didn't erase my frustrations, it helped me understand why she responded the way she did. The shift came on a seemingly ordinary night. She had gone out with a group of her friends for a long overdue girls' night. I wasn't expecting anything earth-shattering to come from it. In fact, I was just glad she was taking some time for herself and enjoying a night away from the stress of home. When she came back, though, something was different. She walked through the door with a mix of excitement and disbelief. "I think I might have ADHD," she said, almost as if it were a revelation. I blinked, trying to process the words I'd been waiting to hear for years. My first instinct was relief. Finally, she was seeing what I had seen. But that relief was quickly overshadowed by confusion and, if I'm honest, frustration. It wasn't as though the idea had never been suggested before. I asked her what made her think that, and she launched into a story about her conversation with one of her friends. Apparently, she'd been venting about her struggles, always being late, feeling overwhelmed by messes, never finishing tasks. And her friend had casually suggested ADHD as a possibility. The same friend who, it seemed, had said what I couldn't for years, without it being taken as an insult. I listened quietly as she recounted how the suggestion just clicked for her. She said it felt like someone had finally given her a name for the invisible force that had been holding her back her entire life. I nodded along, trying to focus on her enthusiasm, but underneath, I couldn't help but feel a pang of bitterness. When I had brought it up, it was met with resistance and defensiveness, but when her friend said it, suddenly it was helpful and insightful. I didn't say anything in the moment. She was finally on the verge of getting answers, and I didn't want to spoil that. Still, it stung to think that my words hadn't been enough, not because they weren't true, but because they'd come from me. A few weeks after that night, she finally went to see a doctor. She came home with the paperwork in her hand and a look on her face that I couldn't quite place, relief mixed with a sense of validation. "I have ADHD," she said, as though the words were unlocking a part of herself she'd been unable to understand for years. She was practically glowing as she talked about the appointment. The doctor had explained how ADHD could manifest in adults, particularly in women, and how it wasn't just about being hyperactive. It was about how her brain processed tasks, priorities, and even emotions. For her, it felt like pieces of a puzzle were falling into place. "It explains everything," she kept saying. I wanted to share in her excitement, I really did, but as I listened, I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of frustration bubbling under the surface. This wasn't new information. It was something I had been trying to help her see for years. Every time I'd brought it up, it had been dismissed as criticism or ignored altogether. Now, because it came from a doctor, it was suddenly real. I didn't say any of this to her. I sat there nodding along, offering encouraging words as she dove into the details of what ADHD meant and how it explained so many of her struggles. She was optimistic about the future, talking about therapy, possible medication, and strategies to help manage her symptoms. But as I looked at her, animated and hopeful, I couldn't shake the thought that this moment could have come so much sooner. For years, I'd lived with the stress and chaos of a reality she was only now ready to acknowledge. It was a mix of relief and resentment, and I wasn't sure how to reconcile the two. That night, as we sat on the couch, I couldn't keep my thoughts to myself any longer. She was still talking excitedly about her diagnosis, how it all made sense now, and how much better things could be moving forward. I listened, nodding along, but the weight of the past 7 years pressed heavily on me. Finally, I interrupted her, trying to keep my voice calm and measured. "I'm glad you've gotten answers," I started, choosing my words carefully. "But I feel like I need to say something. I feel like I'm owed an apology." The room fell silent, her expression shifting from excitement to confusion. "An apology? For what?" she asked, her tone guarded. I took a deep breath and explained, "For the last 7 years, for the stress, the mess, the lateness, for all the times I tried to help, suggested you might have ADHD, and was shut down. If we had addressed this sooner, maybe we could have avoided so much of the frustration and conflict." Her eyes widened, and for a moment she said nothing. Then, suddenly, her confusion turned to anger. "You think I owe you an apology for having ADHD?" she asked, her voice rising. "Do you know how hard it's been for me to live like this, not knowing why I've struggled? And now that I finally have answers, you're making this about you." I tried to explain that it wasn't about blaming her for having ADHD, but about the resistance to addressing it. "I've been trying to support you for years," I said, my voice wavering. "But it's been exhausting, and I wish you could acknowledge that." She stood up, her face flushed with anger. "You have no idea how hard this has been for me," she said before storming out of the room. I sat there, the silence heavy and suffocating, wondering if I'd made a mistake or if my words had simply been too much for her to process in that moment. The house felt eerily quiet after she left the room. I sat on the couch, replaying the conversation in my head, trying to figure out where it had gone so wrong. I knew I hadn't chosen the best moment to bring it up, but the words had been sitting on my chest for so long that they just spilled out. Now I was left wondering if I had hurt her more than I had helped either of us. She spent the rest of the night in our bedroom, the door shut firmly between us. I didn't follow her. Part of me wanted to give her space, but another part of me was afraid of making things worse. I stayed on the couch staring at the ceiling, my thoughts a jumble of guilt, frustration, and a lingering sense of justification. Was I wrong to have said what I did? Or was it fair to finally voice the toll those years had taken on me? Over the next day, she barely spoke to me. Her silence was louder than any argument we'd ever had. She seemed to retreat inward, avoiding me entirely, and I didn't know how to break through the wall that had suddenly appeared between us. Every time I thought about approaching her, I hesitated, afraid of reigniting the argument. I spent that time reflecting on everything. Maybe I had been too harsh. She had just received a life-changing diagnosis, and instead of celebrating this new understanding of herself, I had turned it into a discussion about my own frustrations. At the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling that my words had come from a place of truth. I wasn't asking her to apologize for having ADHD, but for the resistance that had made the past years so much harder than they needed to be. Still, now, that distinction felt lost, buried under the weight of our emotions. In the days following our argument, I found myself reflecting deeply on why I felt so hurt. It wasn't that she had ADHD. That had never been the issue. It wasn't even about the clutter, the lateness, or the unfinished projects. Those were symptoms of something bigger, something I could have accepted more easily if we'd been working together to address them. What stung the most was the years of feeling dismissed. I had spent so much time trying to gently point her toward a solution, only to be met with resistance or outright hostility. Each time I suggested ADHD as a possibility, I wasn't trying to label her or criticize her. I was trying to help her understand herself, and by extension, help us both create a better life together. But instead of seeing it that way, she treated my suggestions as an attack on her character. Every time she dismissed me, it felt like she was saying my perspective didn't matter, that my experience of living with the consequences of her struggles wasn't valid. I tried to be patient, to let her process things in her own time. But as the years went on, that patience turned into frustration and resentment. I felt like I was carrying the emotional and physical burden of her struggles alone, without any acknowledgement from her that it was affecting me too. Her recent diagnosis only magnified these feelings. When her friend suggested ADHD, she listened. When her doctor confirmed it, she embraced it. But when I had spent years trying to offer the same insight, it was dismissed. That discrepancy made me feel invisible, like my words didn't carry the same weight because they came from me. I knew she hadn't done it intentionally, but that didn't erase the impact. For years, I'd been living with the fallout of her undiagnosed condition, trying to hold things together. And now, when we finally had an answer, it felt like she wasn't acknowledging what it had cost me. That's what I needed the apology for. Not the ADHD itself, but the years of feeling unheard and unappreciated. As much as I felt justified in my feelings, I couldn't ignore the nagging question, was I fair to her? She had just received a diagnosis that redefined how she saw herself, and instead of celebrating this newfound clarity, I had made it about the past. Was that really the right moment to bring up my frustrations? Had I allowed my own emotions to overshadow the significance of what she was going through? I thought about how long she had likely struggled without realizing why. She wasn't just scatterbrained or messy. Her brain was wired in a way that made certain things incredibly difficult for her. It wasn't something she chose, and until now, she hadn't had the tools to understand or manage it. From her perspective, my request for an apology might have felt like blaming her for something beyond her control. At the same time, I couldn't help but feel like my own struggles in the marriage had been overlooked. For years, I had put my feelings on hold to support her, hoping she'd eventually come around to addressing the issues that were affecting both of us. But when she finally did, it was because someone else had said the same things I'd been saying all along. That hurt, and I couldn't ignore it, even if the timing of my words wasn't ideal. Ultimately, I realized the issue wasn't just about fairness. It was about how we communicated, or failed to communicate, with each other. She didn't mean to dismiss me, just as I didn't mean to overshadow her diagnosis. We were both caught up in our own perspectives, unable to fully see the other's pain. I wanted to believe there was a way forward, but first, we'd have to figure out how to meet in the middle. As I tried to make sense of the fallout from our conversation, I started thinking more deeply about her perspective. From the outside, it was easy for me to focus on what I had endured, the years of stress and the frustration of feeling dismissed. But for her, this diagnosis wasn't just an explanation for her behaviors. It was a moment of profound self-realization. It forced her to reevaluate years of feeling different or broken, experiences I could only imagine. For most of her life, she had likely been labeled as messy, forgetful, or careless. Those aren't easy things to hear, especially when you don't understand why you struggle to meet expectations that seem effortless for others. I could see now that my suggestions about ADHD, even if well-intentioned, probably felt like more of the same to her, another way of saying she wasn't measuring up. In her mind, I wasn't trying to help her, I was just pointing out what was wrong. Her reaction to her friend's suggestion and the subsequent diagnosis also started to make more sense. Hearing it from someone outside our relationship might have felt less charged, less personal. When I brought it up, it was tied to our conflicts, to the ways her behavior impacted me. But when her friend mentioned it, it was in the context of her own struggles. It probably felt safer, like someone was seeing her pain without judgment. I also thought about how overwhelming it must have been for her to process the diagnosis itself. In one sense, it was validating. It gave a name to what she'd been experiencing and opened the door to solutions. But it also meant facing the reality that her struggles weren't going to magically disappear. This was something she would have to work through for the rest of her life. When I asked for an apology, I hadn't considered how much she was already grappling with. To her, it might have felt like I was asking her to shoulder even more guilt at a time when she was finally starting to find clarity. That realization didn't erase my hurt, but it helped me understand hers. Thinking about her friend's role in her breakthrough made me realize just how critical support networks are. It wasn't that her friend had said something revolutionary. After all, I'd been saying the same thing for years. But it came from a different voice, in a different context, and that made all the difference. Her friend wasn't involved in the daily grind of our lives. She didn't see the clutter piling up or feel the frustration of running late to every event. Instead, she listened to my wife's struggles with fresh ears and without the baggage of our shared history. That distance likely allowed her to frame ADHD in a way that didn't feel critical or personal. It wasn't tied to years of conflict or unresolved frustrations. It was just an observation, a suggestion offered without strings attached. I started to appreciate how important those external perspectives can be. Sometimes it takes someone outside of the situation to point out what's been staring us in the face. For my wife, her friend's comment wasn't just a suggestion, it was an invitation to see herself through a lens of understanding rather than judgment. That's something I, despite my best efforts, hadn't been able to give her. At first, it stung to think that my words hadn't been enough. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized it wasn't about me. It wasn't that she didn't trust me or value my perspective. It was that hearing it from me carried the weight of everything else we'd been through. Her friend's voice was a lifeline, precisely because it wasn't tied to those years of tension. This realization gave me a new perspective on how to support her moving forward. I didn't have to be the only voice in her journey. Sometimes, the best way to help someone is to let them hear what they need from someone else. Once the initial shock of her diagnosis settled, we began to confront what it truly meant to live with ADHD, not just for her, but for both of us. For her, it was a mix of validation and overwhelming realization. She told me that finally having a name for her struggles felt like a relief, but it also made her grieve the years she had spent feeling lost, confused, and frustrated with herself. She started diving into research, devouring articles and forums about adult ADHD. Every day, she'd share something new she'd learned, how executive dysfunction explained her difficulty starting or completing tasks, how time blindness made punctuality feel like an impossible challenge, or how emotional dysregulation amplified her reactions to even small stresses. It was like watching her piece together, a puzzle she hadn't known existed. At first, I felt a sense of hope. With this newfound understanding, we could work together to create systems and routines that would help both of us. She began therapy, and her therapist introduced her to techniques that could make daily life more manageable, like breaking tasks into smaller steps or setting timers to help her stay on track. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. The diagnosis didn't magically make everything better. There were still late mornings, cluttered rooms, and emotional outbursts. The difference now was that we had a framework to work from. When she struggled, it didn't feel like a personal failing or a deliberate choice. It was part of how her brain worked, and knowing that helped me approach those moments with more patience. Still, it was a process of adjustment for both of us. I had to let go of the resentment I'd been carrying and recognize that her ADHD wasn't something she could just fix. She, in turn, had to acknowledge how her behaviors had affected me and learn to ask for help without feeling ashamed. It was a delicate balance, but one we were both committed to navigating together. Slowly, we began to rebuild, not just our routines, but our understanding of each other and what it meant to truly support one another. As we started to settle into this new phase of understanding, the issue of the apology lingered in the background. I hadn't brought it up again since that night, but the weight of it still hung in the air between us. I wondered if she had thought about it, if she understood what I was really asking for. At the same time, I questioned whether I had been fair in asking for it at all. One evening, as we sat together after dinner, she broke the silence. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began, her voice quiet but steady, "about the apology." My heart raced, unsure of what was coming next. "I want to say I'm sorry," she continued. "Not for having ADHD, I know that's not what you meant, but for how I reacted when you tried to help me. I didn't want to hear it, and I pushed you away instead of listening. I think I was scared of what it might mean if you were right, but I know that doesn't make it any easier for you." Hearing her say those words was a relief I hadn't realized I needed so desperately, but I also felt the need to meet her halfway. "I appreciate that," I said, "and I'm sorry too for not always handling things the best way. I should have been more patient, more careful with how I brought things up. I just wanted to help, but I know it didn't always come across that way." In that moment, it wasn't about who was right or wrong. It was about acknowledging the ways we had both hurt each other, intentionally or not, and making the choice to move forward with empathy. That conversation didn't erase the past, but it gave us a foundation to start healing. In the days following our conversation, I couldn't help but reflect on how different things might have been if we had arrived at this understanding sooner. It wasn't about dwelling on regrets or blaming her for the years of frustration. I knew that wasn't fair or productive, but the thought lingered. What if she had been open to the idea of ADHD earlier? What if we had tackled this together from the start? I imagined how our early years of marriage might have looked if we had had the tools we were just now beginning to discover. The late mornings and missed plans might have been fewer. The clutter that took over entire rooms could have been managed more effectively. Perhaps the emotional outbursts and cycles of self-criticism would have been less frequent if she had understood why she felt so overwhelmed. And maybe, just maybe, I wouldn't have felt so alone in carrying the weight of it all. But as much as I let my mind wander down those paths, I knew better than to stay there for too long. The reality was that we didn't know then what we know now. We were doing the best we could with the knowledge and tools we had at the time, and while it was tempting to wonder how much heartache could have been avoided, it was also clear that those struggles had shaped us, individually and as a couple. If anything, this journey had taught me the value of resilience and the importance of meeting people where they are. It wasn't just about my wife coming to terms with her ADHD, it was also about me learning to communicate more effectively, to balance patience with honesty, and to let go of my own expectations of how things should be. In the end, I realized that while the past had been challenging, it had also brought us to this moment of clarity. What could have been was a powerful thought, but it wasn't as important as what could still be. That was where I needed to focus, on the possibilities of the future, rather than the missed opportunities of the past. Looking back on everything we had been through, I started to see the lessons hidden in the chaos. The struggles of the past 7 years hadn't been easy, far from it, but they had taught me a great deal about myself, my wife, and what it takes to make a marriage work when the road isn't smooth. One of the biggest lessons was patience. I used to think of myself as a patient person, but these years tested that belief in ways I hadn't expected. Patience wasn't just about waiting for things to get better. It was about understanding that growth and change don't happen on my timeline. It was about learning to sit with my own frustrations without letting them turn into resentment. I also learned the importance of communication, not just talking, but listening. There were times when I thought I was being helpful, but my words weren't landing the way I intended. I wasn't always considering how my wife might hear what I was saying, or how my approach might have made her feel defensive. Learning to frame my concerns in a way that felt supportive rather than critical was a hard but necessary skill. Finally, I came to understand the value of empathy. Living with someone who has ADHD required me to step outside my own perspective and try to see the world through her eyes. What felt like carelessness to me was, for her, a daily battle against overwhelm and disorganization. That shift in perspective didn't erase my frustrations, but it did help me approach them with more compassion. These lessons weren't easy to learn, and I'm still working on applying them every day, but they've given me a deeper understanding of what it means to be a partner, to not just share a life with someone, but to truly support them as they navigate their own challenges. During the most challenging moments of our journey, I found myself turning to others for advice. Whether it was friends, family, or even strangers on the internet, I needed to know if what I was feeling was valid, or if I was just being selfish and impatient. Sometimes just putting my thoughts out there felt like a release, even if I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answers. I vividly remember the first time I confided in a close friend about the struggles in our marriage. I hesitated before sharing, worried that I might come across as unsupportive or overly critical of my wife. But when I finally opened up, my friend listened without judgment. "It sounds exhausting," they said, their tone full of understanding, "but it also sounds like you love her a lot. Have you told her how all this is affecting you?" That simple question stuck with me. I realized that while I had voiced my frustrations to her over the years, I hadn't always articulated the emotional toll it was taking on me. I tended to focus on specific problems, clutter, tardiness, unfinished tasks, without expressing the deeper feelings of isolation and resentment that were building up beneath the surface. Online forums were another surprising source of clarity. I stumbled upon discussions from people who were married to partners with ADHD, and their stories echoed my own. It was comforting to see that I wasn't alone, but it was also eye-opening to read perspectives from the ADHD partners themselves. Many talked about how overwhelming it felt to be labeled as difficult or frustrating, and how much they wished their loved ones understood that their behaviors weren't intentional. These conversations helped me see both sides of our situation more clearly. They validated my feelings while also reminding me of the importance of empathy. Seeking advice didn't solve all our problems, but it gave me the perspective I needed to approach them in a more constructive way. It also reminded me that no marriage exists in isolation. Sometimes leaning on others is the best way to find your footing again. After her diagnosis, everything seemed to shift, not just in her understanding of herself, but in how we approached our lives together. It was as if we'd finally uncovered the hidden rulebook that explained so many of the struggles we'd faced. For her, the diagnosis wasn't just a label. It was a roadmap, a way to finally understand why certain things had always been so difficult. She spent hours diving into resources, from books to online forums, eager to learn everything she could about ADHD. It was like watching her rediscover herself. She would excitedly share what she'd learned, explaining how certain behaviors, things I'd once interpreted as carelessness, were actually the result of her brain working differently. It was enlightening for both of us, though at times it was overwhelming. The sheer volume of information and strategies was daunting, and not everything worked right away. Therapy became a cornerstone of her journey. Her therapist helped her unpack the years of frustration, guilt, and self-criticism she had carried. They worked together to develop tools that could help her navigate everyday life. Things like creating routines, breaking tasks into smaller steps, and using reminders to keep herself on track. It wasn't an instant fix, but it gave her a sense of control she hadn't had before. For me, processing her diagnosis meant letting go of the idea that she could simply try harder to overcome her struggles. It required me to reframe my expectations and recognize that her ADHD wasn't a personal failing. It was something we needed to manage together, as partners. There were still challenges, but there was also hope. Hope that we could build a life that worked for both of us, using this newfound understanding as a foundation. For the first time in years, it felt like we were truly on the same team. The diagnosis marked a turning point in our marriage, a chance to rebuild with a stronger foundation. For the first time, we weren't simply reacting to problems as they came up. Instead, we were working proactively to address the underlying challenges her ADHD brought into our lives. It wasn't easy, but it felt like progress. One of the first things we did was establish a shared plan for managing the clutter. It wasn't about achieving a perfect, Pinterest-worthy home. It was about creating a space where we both felt comfortable and respected. We started small, tackling one room at a time, sorting through years of accumulated chaos. It was slow, and there were moments when her frustration flared up, but we found ways to support each other. When it felt overwhelming for her, I stepped in to help organize. When I started to feel irritated, I reminded myself that this was part of the process. Time management was another hurdle, but we approached it with the same teamwork. She began using apps and timers to help her stay on track, while I learned to be more flexible with my expectations. If she was running late, I tried to focus on the progress she was making rather than the setbacks. Celebrating small wins, like leaving the house on time for an appointment, helped us both feel more optimistic about the changes we were making. Perhaps the most significant change, though, was in how we communicated. The diagnosis gave us a shared language to talk about things that had once been sources of tension. Instead of blaming or resenting each other, we focused on finding solutions. I learned to express my frustrations in a way that didn't feel accusatory, and she began to open up about how certain tasks or situations made her feel. This new beginning wasn't about erasing the past, but about learning from it. The challenges we faced hadn't disappeared, but they no longer felt insurmountable. Together, we were building a life that accommodated both of our needs, a life that felt more balanced, more compassionate, and, most importantly, more intentional. The clutter had always been one of our biggest sources of tension, so it made sense to tackle it as one of our first steps forward. We knew this wasn't going to be a one-time fix. It was going to take time, patience, and a system we could stick to. For her, the mess wasn't just physical, it was also emotional. Each pile of papers or box of forgotten projects was a reminder of something she'd meant to do but never finished, and letting go wasn't easy. We started with the rooms that were the most overwhelming, the ones I had come to think of as no-go zones. I suggested we treat it like a team effort. She would decide what to keep or toss, and I would help with sorting and organizing. This way, she wouldn't feel like I was taking control, but she wouldn't be doing it alone either. At first, progress was slow. She would pick up an item, get lost in the memories it brought back, and struggle to decide what to do with it. I realized that what seemed like junk to me held emotional weight for her. I had to learn to be patient, to give her the time she needed to process those decisions. We also implemented strategies that aligned with her ADHD. Clear bins replaced opaque boxes so she could see what was inside at a glance. Labels helped her remember where things belonged. Most importantly, we made a rule to keep things simple. No elaborate systems that would be impossible to maintain. It wasn't perfect. There were setbacks and the clutter didn't disappear overnight. But as we worked through the mess, room by room, I noticed something changing, not just in our home, but in her. She started to feel more in control, more capable, and for the first time in years, our house began to feel like a shared space again, a place where both of us could breathe. As we made progress in organizing our home and lives, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought us here. For so long I had been caught up in my own frustrations, focusing on how her behaviors affected me. But now, with the benefit of hindsight and a better understanding of ADHD, I started to see those years through a different lens, one colored by compassion rather than resentment. I thought about how overwhelming it must have been for her, not knowing why certain things felt impossible when they seemed so simple to others. The frustration of losing track of time or being unable to finish tasks wasn't just mine to bear. It was hers too, and likely even more painful because she didn't have the words to explain it. She wasn't just messy or late for the sake of it. She was struggling against her own brain's wiring, a battle I couldn't fully understand. I also looked back at my own actions and realized I hadn't always been as patient or understanding as I should have been. There were times when I let my frustrations spill over, when I said things in the heat of the moment that probably made her feel judged or inadequate. While I'd always believed I was trying to help, I could see now that my approach had often added to her stress rather than alleviating it. What stood out most, though, was how much we had both endured to stay together. Despite the misunderstandings, the arguments, and the moments when it felt like we were speaking entirely different languages, we never gave up on each other. That realization filled me with gratitude, not just for her resilience, but for her willingness to face this diagnosis and work through it with me. Looking back with compassion didn't erase the challenges we had faced, but it reframed them. Instead of seeing those years as wasted or filled with conflict, I began to see them as a testament to our commitment and love. They were the foundation upon which we were now building something stronger. If there was one thing that changed the most through this journey, it was my understanding of empathy. Before, I thought being empathetic meant feeling sorry for someone or cutting them extra slack because they were struggling. But what I've learned is that true empathy is so much deeper than that. It's about stepping outside your own perspective and genuinely trying to understand someone else's experience. For so long, I had seen the chaos in our lives as something she was creating, something I had to deal with. But now I realize she wasn't choosing this chaos. She was as much a victim of it as I was, if not more. Her ADHD wasn't something she could will away, and it wasn't a sign of carelessness or a lack of love for me. It was a daily struggle that she carried silently, without the tools or understanding to manage it. Once I started approaching our challenges with empathy, everything shifted. Instead of seeing her lateness as a personal insult, I saw it as a reflection of her struggle with time blindness. Instead of viewing the clutter as evidence that she didn't care about our home, I understood it as her way of holding on to ideas and possibilities. It didn't mean I was okay with these things, but it allowed me to address them from a place of support rather than resentment. Empathy also helped me acknowledge my own role in our struggles. I could see how my frustration, even when justified, might have come across as criticism. I could understand why she might have felt defensive when I brought up ADHD, and why it was so much easier for her to hear it from someone else. This newfound empathy didn't solve all our problems, but it gave us a better starting point. It allowed me to approach her with kindness, even when things were hard, and in turn, it allowed her to feel safe enough to be vulnerable and honest about her own challenges. It reminded me that we were a team, facing these struggles together, not as adversaries but as partners. As I sit here reflecting on the past 7 years, I find myself struck by how much we've grown, both as individuals and as a couple. Our journey has been far from easy, marked by frustration, misunderstandings, and moments of doubt. But it's also been a journey of resilience, love, and a deepening understanding of one another that I wouldn't trade for anything. Her ADHD diagnosis was a turning point, not just for her but for both of us. It gave her a lens to understand herself and a path toward managing the struggles that had felt insurmountable for so long. For me, it offered clarity about the challenges we'd faced and a chance to let go of the resentment I'd been carrying. More importantly, it reminded me of why I fell in love with her in the first place, not for her perfection but for her creativity, her passion, and her willingness to keep trying, even when things felt overwhelming. I've learned so much about the importance of patience, communication, and empathy in a marriage. I've learned that love isn't about fixing someone or making them conform to your expectations. It's about supporting them as they navigate their own path. It's about finding balance between addressing your own needs and understanding theirs, and choosing every day to see the best in each other even when it's hard. We're not perfect, and we don't have it all figured out. There are still moments of messiness and miscommunication, times when the clutter creeps back in or we slip into old patterns. But the difference now is that we face these moments together, armed with the tools and understanding we've worked so hard to build. Looking ahead, I feel hopeful, not just because of the changes we've made, but because of the love that's carried us through. Our marriage isn't perfect, but it's ours, and it's stronger now than it's ever been. If these past years have taught me anything, it's that even the toughest challenges can lead to growth if you're willing to face them with an open heart and a commitment to moving forward together.